everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Accelerating Through the Turn, Shaping the Future Workforce, second in our series. And now, I would like to introduce you to your host, Laura Manson-Smith.
And a warm welcome again to you to Accelerating Through the Turn. And this edition of our webinar series is focused on helping organizations come out of COVID-19 stronger with a future-fit workforce. Now, if you go back 6 months in time, think about how the future of work was being talked about. To me, it was almost portrayed as science fiction, something that would happen someday in the future. But there were indications that this was starting to change. Do you recall, for example, the discussions about millions of truck drivers who would become unemployed, replaced by driverless vehicles? One of the implications of COVID-19 is that some of these future work trends will for sure accelerate, and digitalization is definitely one of them. But some predictions may not play out as we originally thought. Perhaps we'll be impacted less by the megatrend of globalization and rather by regionalization. Now, in yesterday's webinar, we covered organizational topics, including how you can preserve the really positive behaviors that you see in your organization despite all the difficulties. And these are things like agility, customer centricity, and empathy. Today is focused on the people in your organization. And again, we recognize that many of you might be taking really tough decisions right now about your people. And indeed, many may be impacted by those decisions right now. We also know that lots of you are thinking about the future. And that's what we're going to focus on today, specifically 3 topics. First, we'll look at how to transition your employees back on site, whether that's into an office building or a factory or a store, recognizing that some of your people may continue working remotely. Second, we'll look at how the workforce and the skills that your people have and the jobs that they do will need to change as we enter a completely new business context and social context. And then finally, we'll look at immediate steps that you can take to start to reshape your workforce for the future. Here with me today, I have my colleagues, Melissa, Jeff, Tracy, and Tim, and they bring lots of experience in workforce transformation and organizational change. But first, I'd like to introduce to you Gary Burnison, our CEO from Korn, Ferry.
Hello, everybody. The topic is the future of work, but for me, the future is today. As I've looked at this, it's really been a triangulation of cash, biology, and psychology. And the more cash that you have as a company or even personally, the more freedom you're going to have to maneuver and to act. Biology will determine, the pacing of this. And eventually there will be a vaccine, there will be a solution. But realistically, that's out there. And I think people are quite naive in looking at their businesses. I mean, this is probably, 18 months, 24 months. And in the middle is psychology. And it's full of change. And so this thing about the future of the workforce, the future is actually here today. People don't change unless there's a reason to change. And what I found as a CEO, and look, this is a nightmare. There's no question about it. And the decisions that people have gone through, that we've gone through, are absolutely, they're gut-wrenching. They're terrible things. It's a little bit like, a fire here in Southern California last year. It was just unbelievable in terms of the loss of, of houses, of lives, of acres of property. And one night it was midnight, and I was out, I could see that the hills around us, they were ablaze. And, I was stupid. I was out trying to hose down the house. I don't know what I was thinking, maybe pretending I was in control when actually I wasn't. My wife just yelled at me. She goes, we're out of here. And we were gone in literally minutes. And just as we were leaving, the fire department was coming and saying, you need to evacuate. And as we were driving out, we saw, literally the flames were coming down to the street. And then to watch over the next few days as you know, neighbors' homes burned down. I mean, it was just, it was terrible. It was really, really hard. And I think the past few weeks have been exactly like that. They've been hard. But, you know, an amazing thing happened. It was probably 4 or 5 months later there that the fires were followed by really heavy rain. And one day I was headed to the beach, and it's probably 4 or 5 months after the fire. And it was unbelievable what I saw in the sky. I mean, there were all these butterflies. I mean, literally millions of butterflies flying, you know, over the car, never hitting the windshield. And it was amazing to look at the earth that was charred, and just to think of the resilience of nature, the resilience of humanity. And I think that's what we're going to see here on the other side, is that I would venture to say that there's going to be more change here in the next couple of years than there's been in the last 20 years. Change is going to be all around us. And as a CEO, once you get past the fire and the devastation, you want to drive change, because actually this is a time where you can do it culturally. And so what I would say in terms of the future of the workforce, it's today. And there's one thing by far that we would say, that Korn Ferry would say, is the number one predictor of executive success. And that's learning agility, strategic agility, change agility, mental agility. We would hang our hats that that's the number one predictor of success. And so as we would be looking at a workforce, even for ourselves, and we're going to drive tremendous change, that by far is the number one characteristic. I mean, I'll give you an example. I looked at a Korn Ferry, a psychometric assessment. We use this, what we call 4D. We look at people's traits, drivers, competencies, and experiences. And I looked at one a few days ago for a potential candidate. And it showed that the person was very linear in their thinking. And, you know, I'm not going to go forward because in this kind of environment, this is a unique moment in time to create an incredible amount of change. And so, yeah, that's what I would be looking for as a CEO. I recognize this has been a very, very tough time. But like those, you know, the fire here in Southern California, there can be a metamorphosis, and change can be incredibly positive. So with that, I thank you for joining us, and have a great webinar.
Thanks so much, Gary. I think some great thoughts there about resilience and rebirth and the future, and a really wonderfully positive note to kick us off. So, you know, let's get right to it. Let's talk about sort of the first step in what has to happen for workforces. And that's really about creating a secure environment as workers come, and I make air quotes here, come back. So Jeff, share some thoughts with us about how we're looking at this issue.
Thanks, Melissa. It's important to understand that it's very much different industry and by region. And so, for example, you're not going to see the same things in a plant in Tokyo as you would a hospital in New York City. And with that as context, there are 4 broad-based groups that we see as organizations think about bringing people back. You know, the first is thinking about people that never left. So these are your heroes you see on TV, your doctors, your nurses, grocery store workers. And the activities around this group are really about building employee engagement and well-being, work continuity, as several of them and several organizations are running short-staffed, continuing to make sure they feel safe and supported, and recognizing them for the heavy burden and for the courage they display in the time. The second group are people that won't be coming back, but that are going to work from home. And this has kind of been the world's largest work from home experiment. And many organizations are seeing productivity stayed intact. And with the down economy, organizations are looking to save money on real estate. These are usually, but not only, accounting, finance, marketing, inside sales, traditional office roles. And for this group of people, organizations are really looking at setting expectations for working from home, measuring productivity, making sure IT is something that's available and people are comfortable with their setups, and then building a sense of community. There's been research that we've seen and done around loneliness from working from home, making sure that as humans, that interaction, that social interaction, that network still exists for those that are going to work from home after the pandemic. That brings us to our third group, and this is the vast majority of folks, and when people say back to work, who they're typically talking about or thinking about. And these are folks that are going to come back likely in waves, but from being at home for several months, depending on where you are from a geographic standpoint, to the office. And there's really two sets of activities, two buckets of activities that we're seeing organizations think through and we're advising them on. One is to assess the readiness of employees, confirming their health status, both mentally and physically. Are they ready and willing to come back? And have they been in contact with a COVID positive patient? Addressing privacy concerns. There are going to be many situations where there's a potential for a pre-existing condition that an employee wanted to keep confidential. How is that going to be handled within organizations? There's a lot of thought around legal action. Are there going to be new compliance policies and waivers of immunity? What happens if people come back to work and get sick? What role does the employer play in that scenario? And then broadening benefits, particularly around sick leave and childcare, to address the changes that likely will come. The next bucket within this big group is really changes to the actual work environment. Most organizations right now are thinking about an A-B return schedule where a group will come in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, a separate group would come in Tuesday, Thursday, to divvy up and create smaller groups so there's not that widespread gathering of employees in a given office or a plant. There are going to be policies around monitoring visitors and making sure that they are tracked with a lot of structure and discipline. We're going to see offices be separated by distance where appropriate, shutting down of common areas, encouraging employees to bring their own food from home, providing hand sanitizer and soap, disencouraging large gatherings, and then really developing a plan for a scenario if there is a positive case. And so it brings us to our final group. We've talked about people who never left, people who might come back, and this big returning group. We believe there's going to be a second wave or a large wave that comes in after that returning vanguard hits the economy. And in this second group, it's hopefully going to be the case that they are more impacted by the economic elements of this versus the health elements. And because of that, we're seeing clients think through how can we offer resiliency training and counseling, both for anxiety and stress from this incident, but also it's very likely those employees are going to come back and find many of their friends and colleagues have been laid off or furloughed. A real emphasis on cross-training to make sure that work continuity continues, and if there is an outbreak, work can go on. Succession planning for key roles. You hate to think about it, but there's been at least 2 examples of prominent executives that have tested positive for COVID and passed away, making sure organizations aren't vulnerable in that respect. And then a real redefinition of goals and performance metrics as everyone operates under these new conditions. So those are the 4 broad-based groups we're seeing. And again, from a context standpoint, we are seeing big differences in industries and geographies, but that's how most leaders are navigating the back to work concept.
Thanks, Jeff. I think there's a lot of really good concrete suggestions there and some great observations. So let's think about, as we're going through this huge wave of change, and then we believe the next wave is actually kind of even bigger in a way and more seismic. And there are a couple of great questions in the chat about, are people really ready for change right now with everything that's going on emotionally? How do you break down resistance? And, with everything we're going to talk through, I just wanted to give kind of 2 quick headlines around kind of number 1, the role for leadership empathy, and number 2, really the role for employee listening and employee dialogue and not kind of broadcasting messages out. And we'll get into a bit more of how to make that change happen, but I just wanted to call that out because I thought those were excellent questions. So what we'll be talking about for the rest of the webinar is 3 themes. Number 1, how will work change? Number 2, how will your workforce change coming out of all of this? And then number 3, what are some strategies to make those transitions? And we'll talk about some examples from our experiences, and we'll really try to get pretty practical in terms of the actions you can implement in your own organization. So let's start with that first kind of most fundamental question. How will work change? So the caveat here, we've been talking about work changing for a long time, right? Digitization has been changing work fast, and business and society and people's preferences are changing. But we wanted to really highlight in the COVID context, how are these things changing quicker in many ways, and what are some of the unanticipated changes? So first of all, the content of work is changing. Different work actually needs to be done. Organizations realize they need to know their customers better if they're interacting with them intermediated by technology. They might need to pivot to a more tech-enabled business model. You hear Bob Iger talking about a Disney with fewer employees. That's automation to drive health and safety for both park visitors and for their employees themselves. But different work being done is only one piece of the puzzle. We also need people to work in different ways. So that's, do you need to engage your workforce around different ways of working, not just remote work, but maybe quicker decision-making, more fluid teams? Do you need to enable a more virtual or a more distributed workforce going forward? A lot of companies have kind of everyone at headquarters, right? Does that model blow up? And I think this will be very interesting for some of the large tech companies that have done such a wonderful job with employee experience kind of on these campuses, right? How do they recreate that experience in the virtual world? And then finally, people's preferences have changed. People want the way they work to be different. And here there's actually a really interesting, kind of intersection of interests between organizations and employees. If you think about it, a lot of this kind of interesting disruptive talent, might be tied to particular localities. And so a lot of our clients are saying, well, if we become more remote, we're not tied to the talent pool in a particular regional area. We can recruit from across the country or around the world. So there's some excitement there in terms of people wanting to work differently. So if these are the changes in work, and again, these are trends we've seen that are really accelerating, how does this change the workforce? So we think about the workforce in terms of 6 rights that kind of form the components of what you should think about for the workforce. So, one is the right source. And here, we've talked about increasing automation, right? And so that's everything from contactless ordering, where most of your ordering experience at, let's say, a coffee shop, is digital, and then you just kind of pick your coffee up from the window, all the way through to things like, there are many cities right now where industrial robots actually outnumber human workers. And if you think about safer factories, that'll escalate as well. So that's one piece of how to think about the workforce. Another piece would be the right skills. And this piece is really critically important. So I'm going to ask my colleague, Tim, to talk a little bit about just a deep dive on what skills are going to be important going forward.
Thanks, Melissa. Now, if any of you were on the Transform to Perform webinar yesterday, you'll remember that we discussed organisational capabilities quite a bit. And we highlighted that we're seeing new behaviours arise out of necessity, such as agility, collaboration, customer centricity, and innovation. But we also anticipate that there will be a need for different skills in the future. So on the technical side, look, 80% of the roles that we're currently recruiting into fall into 5 key categories: digital, cloud computing and agile, information security, mobile, and data and analytics. And these are just some of the roles that organisations are currently struggling to fill because of a shortage of high-skilled talent. And we believe this is going to become more difficult as time goes on. Now, on the behavioural side, we've done some research based on thousands of assessments, which shows that people with high learning agility, which is knowing what to do when you don't know what to do, is more important than ever. And this is what Gary was referring to at the top of the webinar. And this stuff is like gold to organisations, particularly as they need to become more nimble to meet evolving customer preferences and demands. But, what does learning agility look like? It's someone who learns fast, someone who can pick up new tasks and functions. It's someone who thrives on ambiguity and complexity, and indeed manage both very well. They're highly motivated. They have this kind of maniacal focus on continuous improvement. They're self-aware. They reflect on the impact they have, but are also deeply insightful about people. They're tolerant of risk as well. They love to try new things and take different approaches. And finally, they're accountable. They like to take the heat when things go wrong, as they can. Now, we also believe there are a set of leadership skills that are critical for the future, and tune into tomorrow's webinar to hear more about that. But before we move on, I just wanted to share a couple of really interesting examples in how skills are changing. So for example, Verizon is retraining and redeploying thousands of its retail employees so that they can provide customer support and telesales from their homes. And a Chinese cosmetics company was forced to close 40% of its stores during the crisis, but they very cleverly have redeployed 100 beauty advisors from these stores to become online influencers. And those influencers are using digital tools such as WeChat to engage customers virtually and drive online sales. And as a result, sales are up 200% on the previous year. So these are really powerful examples of what's possible.
Great, thank you, Tim. All right, so that was our deep dive on skills, and coming back to some of the other 6 rights, I think the right shape, this is one that, again, was changing kind of pre-COVID, that we're hearing a lot of organizations, and you would have heard about this on yesterday's webinar, looking at a transition from a more hierarchical setup to really teams and pools of fluid talent. And I think TBD, how that plays out in the post-COVID environment. How many managers do you need? What kind of structure? Open question. There's also the idea of the right size. And in the current climate, we tend to think about this in terms of, okay, well, this is layoffs, this is furloughs, but the truth is it's a more mixed bag. And that's why there's kind of a huge role for scenario planning. You've got folks like Amazon hiring 100,000 people right now to meet increased demand requirements. So right size is, can go one way or the other. There's also the right site. And here, questions might arise around, concentration of people in a particular building, in a particular geography. Do we need to move to a regional rather than a global model? Again, a lot of transitions, and you're seeing organizations set up some of these, kind of interim sites, which may or may not become permanent in some ways. And finally, there's the idea of the right spend. And again, that's not all kind of just one direction. Let's cut spending. We've also seen some organizations, both in the financial services industry and in the tech industry, say, we're going to take the short-term cash burn and actually retaining at least a very meaningful chunk of our current workforce, if not all of them, because we think it'll be more expensive on the back end to hire back the people we need once a recovery starts. So some really interesting choices about right spend, and also organizations are thinking a lot right now about how do we really redirect funds toward creating the capability, again, that we need for the future. So we've talked about a lot of change taking place, and probably thinking, how's my organization ever going to keep up? And we think a good place to start is to ground in changes at the job level. So my colleague Tracy is a real expert in this kind of work and quite passionate as well. So Tracy, tell us about what you're seeing in terms of job change. As organizations are transforming, what are they doing?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Melissa. I think sometimes it's really difficult to get our heads wrapped around how the work needs to change when there's such a gigantic magnitude of overall business transformation that's taking place. So let's talk about the jobs. And I want to start with the 2 categories that are at the top of the slide. I know that that's very top of mind for many of us at the moment, right? These are the jobs that are lost. It's the jobs that are furloughed or the contingent jobs. And, sometimes jobs are eliminated entirely. And I mean not just the position, not just the employee, but the actual job itself. So when the work is no longer core to the business, or when it's replaced entirely by technology. So for example, photocopy technicians or mailroom clerks, those are jobs we don't tend to have anymore. Many assembly line workers or even leaders of business units that have been disassembled. And sometimes there are other jobs internally where we can safely and successfully reskill, and sometimes we need to think about outplacement support. So that's that category. And then in the second category, some jobs will become contingent. And I think we need to think creatively about the type of work that really does need to be permanently fixed to an org chart, right? And what can we learn? What can we take away from our experiences with furloughs? Retail has always been a really good example of their ability to scale the workforce with contingent workers to meet seasonal demands. And of course, many of those retailers are now facing some widespread furloughs. So as an example, if you're an employer the size of Walmart, this ebb and flow is massive. So their sales surged nearly 20% in March, bringing on a hiring spree of more than 150,000 people, and they've got plans to hire another 50,000. And in the meantime, there's another around 200,000 of their employees, nearly 10% of their workforce, that are actually currently on leave. So, you know, incredible what you can do when you learn to flex the workforce in that way. But we're going to go into a little bit more detail on the bottom three categories here, since these are really important to business transformation. And I'm going to start on the left, because more often than not, jobs actually evolve, right? It results in a shift of focus for the job. So the work here is still core to the organization, but how the work gets delivered changes, or the job starts interfacing differently with others. The sales roles are a really good example here. We're still selling, but perhaps selling different products, or we're connecting with customers differently. And here you want to get under the mindset that needs to change, behaviors. You know, often the skills are still core, but the mindset really needs to change. Then some jobs actually, through business transformation, get elevated. They get bigger jobs. So there's a category of job change at the moment where there are parts of jobs that are being automated, or that the procedural parts of the tasks are being outsourced. And here, when you take the pieces of the job out that are the more straightforward pieces, the human work that remains is usually more complex. So often when we take work out of the organization, the jobs that remain are in fact elevated. And then finally, the brand new jobs are being created, okay? So there are jobs that we hadn't even imagined before, and brand new capabilities that are needed. So for example, you know, our blockchain analysts, machine learning specialists, Scrum Masters, and here we need to define and level the accountabilities, the new skills, the new behaviors with some really great clarity, and then use data to map internal and external candidates.
Great, thanks, Tracy. I think that's a really helpful kind of taxonomy of the different kinds of changes we're seeing. So let's dive deeper into those bottom three situations. And Tim, I think it would be great to just talk us through some examples here. And also, we had some great questions about, you know, these require real mindset shifts. So, you know, talk us through a little bit of kind of how that can be accomplished, even in fairly linear organizations.
Sure. Well, look, let's take a step back and remember that before the crisis, supply chain functions were under tremendous pressure to transform anyway, from changes in consumer habits, the impact on the environment, and digitization. And now, in the midst of the crisis, we've seen governments around the world closing borders. Take a look at Sony, the Japanese electronics firm. They've been unable to send their engineers to their manufacturing hubs in China. And that means they can't support new product launches or provide critical instructions to factory workers. We've also seen suppliers running out of capacity. So in Australia right now, we have the freight industry that's under tremendous pressure, with warehouses and container parks literally overflowing with goods that have been shipped in from China. And these goods, of course, can't be sold because all of the retail outlets are closed. And we've also witnessed a gigantic peak in demand for certain products. Take face masks and surgical gloves, for example. You know, who'd have thought 3 months ago we'd be walking around the supermarket wearing those? And these, of course, are becoming increasingly essential items for billions of consumers. So, you know, the planning function, which is really the brain of the supply chain organization, needs to be more agile than ever. And if we take the role at the center of this function, which is the planner, as an example, this means big shifts in the ways of working.
Terrific. Now, Tim, you spend a lot of time in the supply chain space. For the rest of us, just remind us what a planner does and then how that role is changing.
Sure. Well, a planner is accountable for having material and products delivered on time to the right place. And traditionally, the focus has been mainly on customers rather than consumers, working mostly alone or within the confines of the supply chain function. But the role is changing. I was talking to a supply chain executive about disruption recently, and he said to me, you know, Tim, I want my planners to disrupt my business before anyone else does. And what he means by this is that planners are now not only accountable for architecting the process and system transformation within the supply chain function, but also that their role is critical to driving the growth of the business. And that's because they, as much as anyone else in the organization, need to be focused on the end consumer, embracing change, collaboration, increasingly working with partners beyond the frontier of the organization to deliver growth. You know, and right now, above all, planners need to have a huge level of resilience and empathy to connect with their people as the organization transform in the most difficult of circumstances. Finally, they need to be comfortable managing data scientists because, you know, data and technology are a huge part of what they do now.
Great. So that's a terrific example of an elevated job. But let's talk about a change in focus. So let's look at the sales world. How is that playing out there?
Yes, it's interesting. We're kind of seeing an evolution of the sales role. So if you think visiting clients and prospects to generate more product revenue is an absolute no-no at the moment. And, you know, we can see that business travel is going to become very difficult after the pandemic. But at the same time, of course, many organizations rightfully are more interested in creating deeper relationships with their own customers rather than just being a vendor of a good or a service. And this is certainly what we're seeing in the pharma industry with medical sales reps. You know, they're being encouraged to leverage data insights in order to build a compelling value proposition for clients and prospects, you know, rather than just relying on their charm or their personal presence, you know, to win business. And that's a really big shift in behavior. You know, practically it means an increased focus on the customer by acting as a partner. It means working interdependently with colleagues to solve customer problems, but also thinking deeply about what happens after the sale.
Okay, so if there are new skills and mindsets required, you know, what do organizations actually do to get there? Maybe talk us through, you know, using the example of the planner.
Yeah, so taking the planning example, I mean, we've just been helping a large FMCG business to do exactly this. You know, the first essential step, Melissa, here is to create clarity, you know, for what good looks like in a role, what we call a success profile of the key skills and behaviors. Then we've assessed the community of planners against it, given them some feedback, some space to reflect, you know, where they're strong against the role and where perhaps there are development gaps. And then we've helped provide a program of development because this is about behavior change and that takes time. Mindset shift is not an overnight change. It takes a bit of time and investment. And, you know, at the same time, we've used that assessment data to look at the organization to kind of see if there are any immediate talent gaps that they have that can be plugged with finding recruitment from the external market. And actually we find that running recruitment activity as well as internal assessment and development activity at the same time can be very powerful.
Okay, so if that's, you know, what we think about as jobs are changing, what about when new jobs are created? Tracy, walk us through what happens then.
Yeah, sure, Melissa. And you know what? Let's start with the job design itself when we create jobs. I think it's very important that we start with purpose. So the first thing to get clear on when you're creating a new job is, like, what are you trying to achieve for the organization in adding this job? How is this job going to create value? And it's also important to think not just about this new box that you're adding into the org chart, but also the white space in the org chart. So how does the job relate to the other jobs around it? And I'll give you a really great example here, which is the data scientists, right? These are a new breed of analytical data experts who have the technical skills to solve complex problems, and they've got the curiosity to explore what problems need to be solved. So they're part mathematician, part computer scientist, and part trend spotter. And they play a very key role in enabling our digital transformation. But the irony here is that these expensive data scientists often feed back that they feel very underutilized in their roles. They feel like they're doing kind of baseline analytical work and they're not really clear what's expected of them. So they're missing this sense of job purpose and they're not well tied to the business. And Melissa, I know you and I have talked about this before, this sort of organ rejection of data scientists where they're simply plonked into an organization without clear direction and people aren't really sure how to use them and how to get the most out of that insight. And it is one of the barriers that we see getting in the way of business transformation. So the lesson here is that when you create a new job, it's always important to engage stakeholders in having the conversation around how you're going to define what the role is accountable for. And then carefully align the skills and the capabilities that are needed in order to deliver on that kind of work. So what are the personality traits of a person who would be successful in such a role? And then once you know what good looks like for that role, you can better identify how to fill it. Will you hire, reskill, will you upskill? And so in the middle of this slide, there are 3 options to consider when you're filling a role, and each of these has different implications. Of course, your first option is going to be to hire someone, right? You can look outside the organization, find talent that's going to fill this new technical role. And if you do this, there are a few things you need to keep in mind. First of all, of course, market scarcity. So data scientists are very highly sought after skill set right now. We talked about that earlier. How hard will it be to find this resource? And then cost to hire. This is expensive talent that you're going to be paying a market premium for. You know, on the plus side, you're going to be filling the gap quickly when you're hiring someone with previous direct experience in a similar role elsewhere. And so if you really need that skill set now, you may be prepared to pay more, and that's okay. But then option 2 is to reskill, right? Find someone who's in an adjacent role somewhere in your organization. And reskilling makes the best sense when the work in the new role is similar to the work in another role. So just adding a new skill or technology to existing work. So for example, you may have marketing analysts that have experience in analyzing trends in customer buying patterns or looking at the success of digital marketing campaigns. And you can skill them up in new technologies like Tableau, Hadoop, or Spark, and they could generate more powerful insights with that reskilling. So the work might be graded at the same level, just using new skills instead of old ones. So overall, reskilling is easier than upskilling. And it's because the work isn't necessarily any more complex than the work that's being done today. It's just being done differently with different skills. So other things to think about when reskilling, I mean, really, it's a fantastic strategy from a talent management perspective. Providing these new learning opportunities for your top talent is one of the best ways to engage your people when you really need to, especially now, and to groom those future stars. You do need to be wary of internal pay differentials when you're moving people around. Sometimes that gets in the way. Even though jobs may technically be at the same level of work, they can often be paid differently or have a different kind of pay trajectory. So for example, you might have risk analysts in your risk management function that might move into data science, but the pay opportunity can sometimes get in the way of that transition. So that's important to keep in mind. And then the third option for your newly created data scientist is to upskill. And we call it upskilling when the new work is more complex than the work that the people are currently doing. So it adds an element of risk in the transition. So it's really important when you're talking about upskilling that you quantify the job stretch. So understand the nature of the new job demands and the capabilities that are needed to deliver on that. So for example, we're seeing more and more work in the finance function that's being automated. So you may find that you've got some excess supply in your accounting team. You might have an accountant that you want to upskill into a data scientist. And the first thing to consider is that likely the data scientist is a more complex role. I mean, you might have a very talented, high potential accountant that you think is up to the task, but it's really important to perform a proper job analysis to measure that job stretch so that you can better assess whether an internal candidate is likely to have the horsepower for that bigger job. And this is why it's so important to have job architecture as an underlying tool when you're expecting to launch a significant reskilling or upskilling program. It just helps you to better manage the transition risk and better identify potential feeder roles that you might not have initially thought of for upskilling. Also helps you to better manage the pay implications of these transitions when you're moving some inexperienced talent into more challenging roles.
Great. So let's just, very quickly as we're, running to our close here, just give us a few quick highlights on how we should be thinking about something that's top of mind for a lot of folks right now, which is pay.
Yeah, no, for sure, Melissa, pay is really tough right now, right? Restructuring the business, redesigning jobs. People's first question is, how is this going to impact my pay opportunity? So just briefly then, starting on the left side of the slide, these are the really critical things that organizations need to set straight right away. Aside from the immediate actions around layoffs, around pay cuts, it's really important that we continue to carefully monitor compensation spend against the business performance. So plan what you can afford when it comes to bringing people back off furlough and securing the talent that you need. You know, some of the talent might have become very business critical. You might actually be looking at retention awards, spot incentives. But it's important really to make sure that we are properly rewarding those frontline employees who are working harder than ever before, in some cases risking their health. And so finding a way to recognize today's everyday heroics is really critical to building the trust and the engagement that we need to harness people's energy moving forward. Some incentive decisions need to be made right away, Salesforce in particular for sure. Incentives are meaningless when the goals and targets are no longer relevant. So you may or may not need to restructure the entire program, but recalibrating the targets, the payouts, especially the plan funding, really key in the short term. And then going forward, on the right side of this slide, just really start by getting base salary right. People need the stability right now, and base salary is the core part of the reward mix that people count on to make ends meet. So they really need to know that their pay is fair. So this is a time to pay attention to internal equity, to rely on your job architecture to make sure that job grades are accurately reflecting what people need to do. And then kind of step back and check that we're rewarding the right things, right? You know, reward strategy needs to be revisited when there's a change in strategy, and this is not an ordinary change in the business. So people have been through a lot of examining what's important to us. So it's really important that rewards engage people in a meaningful way, especially now. Might even mean taking a close look at your performance equation, how you define performance now and how you tie that to pay. So team-based incentives can really help people rally around a common goal, and shorter term spot rewards can help to build momentum, encourage agility. Like, I think we need to really start getting creative here.
Great, great. So we're gonna just, headline, we're gonna run a couple of minutes over, so if people can stay on with us for, Jeff is gonna, as he opened us up, close us out by just talking about some practical action.
Thanks, Melissa. There are a series of things we think about from an organizational standpoint around hitting the gas, really getting things off to a strong start. You know, the first is certainly understanding that returning to work needs to be customized for each population group that we talked about in the open, particularly understanding the differences and appreciating the differences between full-time work from home and those returning to the office. Also, support of management is becoming a big issue that organizations are having to deal with in a more acute way than originally thought, primarily because managers are having to work long hours and make some very tough decisions on staffing, which has been emotionally draining across the last several weeks. So supporting managers, understanding the situation they're in, making sure they've got the tools they need, and that they're balancing their personal wellness with performance of the organization is going to be a key imperative. Melissa talked about capturing real-time learning and employee listening. We believe that employee engagement and surveying is going to increase in frequency and value, and that the focus is going to be around driving change and not scoring or benchmarking. We believe that the job architecture is going to likely evolve, anchored in how people do the work. Tracy mentioned how job design and job architecture is going to change. We're seeing already hybrid roles evolve where employees are taking on more responsibility or cross-functional responsibility in the short term and in many cases for less compensation. Performing quick hire and reskill assessments, again, being data-driven, as Tracy had mentioned. The largest mistake we're seeing being made there is not fully capturing and appreciating where employees currently are and making sure that transition is a smooth one. And then finally, making sure that rewards are addressed. There are many cases in this environment where benefits packages and salaries that make sense in the short term are not the same as in the past, and there are likely going to be reductions and increases in different elements of the benefits package for most workers. So those are the things that we see from an organizational structure that if leadership focuses on and gets right, we believe they'll be well positioned to accelerate through the turn.
Thanks, Jeff. And I'd like to wrap us up with a few key points. First of all, if you weren't on yesterday's webinar, then I just wanted to let you know that we have made a version of our Korn Ferry organization scan diagnostic available on our website. And basically, this is where you take your phone and hold it up to the organization scan, the QR code, and it will take you through to that diagnostic, which you'll get a report back on straight away. Secondly, everyone who registered for this particular webinar will get an email with a link to the recording and the slides right after. I saw a couple of people in the Q&A said they didn't get it from yesterday. If you didn't, if it got held up somewhere in the ether, don't worry, it will be on our website Monday at the latest, and you can get access to that. And finally, we'd just like to remind you that we have our final webinar in this series tomorrow at the same time, and I'll be back with another set of colleagues. So very much hope to see you tomorrow, and until then, goodbye. Thank you.